Welcome to another Shorts Omnibus, made up of some of my weekly shorts about history, literature, myths, and cinema. This is my first 10 concentrating on all the nonsense that we as a species got up to in the 20th century, and the occasional damn inspiring tale that everyone should know about. Back in the early 80s, with the deadline for returning Hong Kong to China creeping up, the Thatcher government briefly considered a plan that would see the entire population moved from Asia to a purpose-built megacity in Northern Ireland. The city would have been between Derry and Coleraine and needed to have space for 5.5 million people, or about 3 times the rest of the country's population, which no doubt would have had a calming effect on the then very violent troubles the civilish war Northern Ireland had between the 60s and the 90s. I'm from just down the road from where it would have been built, and I have to say, I kinda wish I could get a peek into the world where this happened. The biggest city on the island by far, the sign of Northern Irish culture with the dragon-wielding orange parades, or a Chinese take on Irish dancing. It'd be vivid as hell! And I'm a little biased, of course, but I feel Northern Ireland's take on Chinese takeaway is fucking fantastic. So the cuisine would have been amazing. I'm guessing you're all familiar with the wave, the time Ron Jones, a Californian high school teacher, accidentally began a Nazi movement in his school, and then kept it going as a learning experience for the kids, who were so sure they wouldn't have fallen for the Nazis if they'd been in Germany in the 1930s. If you aren't familiar with that, all that happened. After a few days, some property destruction and violence, he pulled the plug by telling the kids that their local club was actually a national movement that was led by Hitler. There's been a few films based on this whole thing. Anyway, the teacher was fired, but not for any of that. Oh no, it was a few years later, and he was fired for A, being a socialist, and B, opposing the Vietnam War. The students, you'd think, would be happy to see the back of him protesting on his behalf. Apparently, he was an excellent teacher. Anyway, just in case you wanted a particularly stark example of how much the USA, even at its most liberal, hates socialism more than fascism, there you go. Creating Nazis, giving kids psychological trauma, physical violence, and property destruction is fine. Not like something serious, like opposing war and thinking the rich should pay more taxes. The SS Baychimo was a German ship launched in 1914 as the SS Elvan, named after the Angerman, a Swedish river. After the end of the First World War, it was ceded to the UK as part of the war reparations and renamed the Baychimo. The name comes from Bay, as in Bay, and Chimo from Simo, an Inuktitut greeting. So the name means, "Hello, Bay!" The Baychimo was a very modestly sized transport ship designed for the cold. Even in its earlier incarnation, it spent a bunch of time in Swedish waters. Anyway, it was primarily used by the Hudson Bay Company, shipping stuff around the cold north, collecting pelts, bringing supplies, that sort of thing. In October 1931, though, it got icebound near Barrow, Alaska. There were 15 crew on board. Usually there would be more like 40, but things were already looking hairy, so the rest of the crew had already left. The remaining 15 were preparing to spend the winter with the ship, and even built a hut on more solid ground for the crew to live in, just in case. It was the right choice. After a long night of blizzard, the crew awoke to find the ship gone. They assumed it was crushed and sank in the night, but no, it was spotted 45 miles away by a seal hunter. So the 15 followed on foot and found it again. They assumed it'd soon sink, so they took the most valuable furs from the hold and awaited rescue. It did not sink. Over the next 38 years, it was seen in the local area numerous times, the Arctic ghost ship. It was even boarded multiple times while icebound. Sometimes used as a shelter by the Inuit, sometimes found by lucky explorers, sometimes visited by sailors out to salvage it, but no one ever managed. It was last seen in 1969 and is presumed sunk somewhere in the cold north, but who knows? In 2006, the Alaskan government set up a project to try and locate it, but no such luck thus far. Just letting you know that convention drama has always been the same. Officially, the first science fiction convention took place in New York in 1939, though if you saw my video on the coming race, you'll know there was a sci-fi convention in London in 1871. But does something really exist until it happened in America? Anyway, Worldcon, as it was called then, happened in 1939, and honestly, it's one of the most amazing examples of famous people who aren't famous yet in one place. There were 200 attendees, and the most famous were Isaac Asimov, John W. Campbell, Ray Bradbury, and Robert Heinlein. But in Fancipedia, I found a list of 160 confirmed attendees, and well more than half were notable enough to have articles written about them. But on to the drama. The convention was organised with the Greater New York Science Fiction Club to coincide with the World's Fair, hence Worldcon. And previously, a smaller group of fans had left the club to split off and form the Futurians, a group of loudly left-wing sci-fi fans who believe that sci-fi should have a political point beyond simple escapism. And the shit at the fan when the Futurians printed a pamphlet titled A Warning and snuck copies into the Worldcon leaflets for attendees. It was a polemic attacking some high-ups in the sci-fi club, and all the Futurians trying to attend were ejected, even though it was apparently the work of one guy called David Kyle. Anyway, those ejected went to a nearby park and had their own mini-convention, without blackjack or hookers because it was too short notice. And among the ejected were luminaries Frederick Pohl and Cyril Kornbluth, because, like I said, this thing was full of people who'll be notable later on. In World War I, ocean liners went to war, and I'm not talking about the Lusitania, famously sunk in 1917, or the Britannic, the sister ship of the Titanic and the Olympic, which was a medical ship. Sometimes they actually converted ocean liners into warships. Probably the most comfortable and most sinkable posting in a navy. Anyway, the Germans decided to take this idea to the next level and take an ocean liner, the Cap Trafalgar, turn it into a warship, and then disguise it as the Carmania, a British ocean liner turned warship.
Everybody got that?
The idea was that the Cap Trafalgar, as the Carmania, would get close to convoys and get the drop on them. The Carmania often did convoy runs. And it might have worked too if it wasn't for the fact that in its first mission, it ran into the Carmania, and one very complicated naval Spider-Man meme later, they were shitting at each other. The battle took over 90 minutes. They were understandably very evenly matched. The Cap Trafalgar was sunk and the Carmania was able to limp into port with a hell of a tale to tell. You might not have noticed, but the Jolly Roger is an unofficial symbol of military submarines, most commonly in the UK, but not exclusively. Now, you'd assume that there must be some sort of a petty story behind this, and you would be right. Basically, in 1901, the First Sea Lord, the official title of the head of the Royal Navy, was a guy called Arthur Wilson, and he hated submarines. He ranted about how they're all pirates, underhanded, unfair, and damned un-English. He also wanted captured enemy submarine crews hanged for piracy. Fast forward to the First World War, and Lieutenant Commander Max Horton, commanding a submarine, remembered Wilson's outburst and decided to troll the now retired old man. He flew a Jolly Roger every time they returned from patrol. Originally, he flew an extra one every time they arrived, but eventually it just got ridiculous, and he was only allowed one. Other submarines started doing the same, and pretty soon there was an entire fleet of submarines with basically the same flag. So crews started decorating theirs based on whatever they felt like. HMS United added a stork and a baby to mark the birth of the captain's kid. HMS Conqueror has an atom because it's literally the only nuclear-powered sub to sink an enemy ship in combat. And my favourite, I can't remember the ship's name or find a photo, but I saw it in a museum. A sub that added the insignia of the TV character The Saint to their flag. There's also common symbols used across the fleet, a ram's head to show that they've rammed an enemy vessel, tomahawks because they fired tomahawk missiles, aircraft because they shot down aircraft, stuff like that. And the best part of all this, Wilson died in 1921. He lived long enough to see his rant become an actual part of trolling military history. George Price was an American academic in the mid-20th century. He started out in chemistry, but worked in a lot of disciplines. As a young man, he worked on the Manhattan Project, and later on became one of the creators of game theory. His biggest thing, though, was the Price equation, where he mathematically deconstructed altruism, demonstrating that self-sacrificing behavior has a biological and evolutionary basis. Basically, he showed, using mathematics, that altruism increases proportionally to how similar you are to the other person. Essentially, you're far more likely to sacrifice your life to save a close relative than a stranger. Because you have so many genes in common, it still counts as an evolutionary victory. Some of you still gets passed on. Anyway, Price was a devout Christian, and the implication of this, that altruism is just biology, so disturbed him that he made it his life's work to disprove it. Not using mathematics. That was watertight. It's still the consensus in science, but with actions. He spent the rest of his life being selfless, becoming obsessively kind. He gave away all his money, he let homeless people live in his home, he helped them take his belongings, he spent as much time as possible volunteering. His glittering scientific career came to a stop. Eventually, he was evicted from his now empty home and started squatting. Just another homeless man in the city. and he took his own life, just 8 years after the publication of his paper that so disturbed him. Agnes wasn't her actual name. No one knows what it was, and that isn't footage of her. That's Zachary Drucker playing her in a documentary called Framing Agnes. She was a trans woman who was interviewed by Dr. Harold Garfinkel in the 1950s. The film Framing Agnes is about the interviews that Garfinkel did back then, with all sorts of trans people, not just Agnes. The transcripts and audio recordings were dramatised by trans actors. It's really quite good, but Agnes, her story is particularly interesting, because as a teenager she managed to get a hold of hormones. It was her mother's post-hysterectomy estrogen pills. The hormone pills we're familiar with wouldn't be introduced until 1960. Anyway, Agnes used the hormones to put herself through a correct puberty. Naturally, she was sent to doctors by her terrified parents, and she managed to not only keep her hormones secret, she managed to convince them, the doctors, that she was intersex. Scientific papers were written about her case, because no one had ever seen anything like it. Then she used the fact that they thought she was intersex to bypass the many, many hurdles that trans people faced to quickly get GRS, because, as it is today, society is all too happy to force on intersex people what trans people have to beg for. She played their system against them, and she won. Then she came clean about what she'd done and disappeared into total anonymity, leaving us only with the name Agnes, and a hell of a tale of, ironically, sticking it to the man.
I have a very hard question. How do you justify the lies?
How do you justify your questions?
Vita Sackville-West was an English author born in the late Victorian era. She was bisexual, wrote a lot of stuff, and was the inspiration for both Virginia Woolf's Orlando and J.R.R. Tolkien's villainous Lobelia Sackville-Baggins.
You know perfectly well who I am, Lobelia Sackville-Baggins. This is my home!
She was the only child of the third Baron Sackville, but because of aristocracy laws, she couldn't inherit the title or the house, knoll, or the lands that came with that, because she wasn't a man. So they went to her uncle, the fourth Baron. This injustice riled her for the rest of her life. She lost a lawsuit over it. She'd grown up in that house. Apart from writing, her main interest was garden design, and she spent years on the gardens, and she was denied both them and the house because she was a woman. And this turned up in both Woolf and Tolkien's work in very different ways. You see, Woolf and Sackville-West were good friends and occasionally lovers. Orlando is a book inspired by the relationship. It's been called the longest love letter in history. And how do you depict bisexuality in the early 20th century? You make the main character change sex partway through. That way, they only have straight relationships. Lord Orlando is born in the Elizabethan era, has many adventures, and lived for centuries. And after somehow transforming into a woman, they almost lose their home because women can't own property. But unlike the real Vita Sackville-West, Orlando wins in the end. Well, Tolkien decided to take the piss out of this woman who lost her home thanks to misogyny. You see, Bilbo and Frodo are landed gentry. Bag End is the Hobbit equivalent of a manor house. Lobelia Sackville-Baggins really wants Bag End and has a claim in it through her husband Otho. And obviously that's not exactly the same as what happened to Vita Sackville-West. But Vita's struggle was in the news, and there's no way Tolkien wasn't aware of it. It is kinda messed up that Tolkien's only pop culture joke, to my knowledge, was taking the piss out of an innocent woman who lost her home and didn't take it lying down. I've seen some people suggest that it's actually a dig at the Normans. You know, bag is Old English and sack is Norman French. And it could well be, I wouldn't be surprised, that is very Tolkien. But it's also a dig at Vita Sackville-West. She was too famous and the names are too similar for it to be coincidence. Until the late 1950s, it was theorized that huskies could survive in Antarctica for about a month. Theorized because there's only one way to test that. But in 1958, a Japanese expedition at Showa Station was evacuating, and the helicopters only had limited space, so the human crew and a new mother dog and her puppies were evacuated, leaving the rest, 15 dogs behind. They were left chained up with several days' worth of food. Just under a year later, humans returned to the base and discovered 7 dead dogs still chained up. 8 had got loose. 6 of those 8 were never seen again, but 2 of them, young brothers Taro and Jirro, were found still alive. No one knows what happened to the missing 6, but you can make some educated guesses. But none of the 8 who were still chained up at signs being eaten, so if the ones who escaped resorted to cannibalism, they ignored the meat that couldn't escape. The prevailing theory is that Taro and Jirro survived on penguins, seals, and taught themselves to hunt marine life that came to the surface of any open water that they found. Taro returned from Antarctica and died aged 14 in 1970, while Jirro continued to be a sled dog at Showa and died a year later in 1960. Taro and Jirro's survival was a sensation at the time and really made for a sea change in how expeditions viewed huskies, going from mere tools okay to be discarded to partners. 2 films being based on their story: Antarctica from 1983, that's where this footage is from, and Disney's 8 Below, which is a far looser retelling. And because it's Disney, 6 dogs survived, not 2.